The Haunting Tales of Dark Shivering.
Dark Shivering is a quaint village which lies on the English and Welsh border. It is notoriously difficult to find, and with neither Wales or England staking their claim over it, it has been largely forgotten and untouched by outside hands. I stayed in Dark Shivering mainly in the 1970s, 1980s and 1990s on business. From the locals I collected many ghost stories. Here are a few of them to make you shiver. The Dungeon. Wichester Donjon is a stone-built keep that was built in 1080 and raises a glass nicely to the original name of the local area. The word donjon is French and over time has probably altered to mean dungeon, and so this gives you an idea of what Wichester Donjon was built for. In its lifetime it did serve as a small prison, but now is open to the public for tours and events. If memory serves me correct, I first met the custodian of Wichester Donjon in the summer of 1990. The keep was holding a battle reenactment one weekend, and after having to stay an extra night in Dark Shivering for work, I decided to visit the donjon for the first time on the Saturday morning. The place was buzzing with excitement, and I remember the air was filled with the smell of pig roast, which I decided I would definitely partake of later. After chatting to the custodian, Mark Duval, whilst watching the battle commence, he offered to give me a tour of the keep whilst the bodies piled up outside. The keep is a large square tower with 4 square turrets at each corner. It looks a basic design from the outside, but once inside it is a maze of corridors, spiral staircases and halls, all leading on to different levels and sections. I was really enjoying my tour with Mark. He was able to bring the dungeon to life in his storytelling, and he was obviously very passionate about the building and its history. At that point he had been the custodian for over 15 years and had private rooms within the property that he lived in. Strangely enough, I wasn't the person to mention ghosts whilst on the tour. It was something Mark obviously included in his storytelling to the public. In fact, he said that if he didn't cover the topic himself, someone would always request a ghost story or two anyway, and so it became the norm. We had just entered the lower level of the keep, which he called the dungeon. It had over 20 small prison cells in, and they looked filthy, dark and dingy. The air felt damp, and the metalwork of the bars looked rusted and malformed after years of neglect. Whilst stood in the dark vastness, he told me about the wailing, screaming and moaning that could be heard from this area at night. He said that he made sure he was up in his apartment each night by sundown, as it was at the top of the building and the screams and cries could not be heard from there. If he had happened to return home late one night, he would always make a dash from the front entrance straight up to his apartment, and leaving lights on after dark was a must to keep his sanity in check. Interestingly, as part of its long history, the dungeon had also had a curse put upon it in the winter of 1684 by a family of travelers. The year 1684 is widely regarded to have had the coldest winter in British history, and this was the year the River Thames froze for more than 2 months. The family of travelers were in Wichester looking for warmth and shelter. The father of the family had gone to the dungeon asking for help for his daughter, who was tormented by high fever, but the dungeon door was firmly shut in his face. That night the daughter died whilst freezing conditions ravaged their makeshift shelter in the woods. The mother was bitter at the loss of her only child, and in the darkest hours of the night she went back to the dungeon and cursed its very foundations with incantations and spells of old. The dungeon would forever be bestowed with bad luck until its gateway lay beneath a freezing white blanket. The village people thought this curse would never be able to be lifted. So, for hundreds of years thereafter, the donjon was filled with unhappy families, unhappy workers and unhappy prisoners. The dungeon overflowed with unnatural death, murder, suicide, torture, and rape. Doom was at every cornerstone, with no end in sight of the curse being lifted. That is until Christmas Day in 1927. The country awoke to heavy snowfall, and at Wichester Dungeon, the gateway was covered in snowdrifts up to 20 feet high. The curse had finally been broken. Too late for many who passed through its long history, but its future certainly looked brighter. Mark Duval feels that by day Wichester Dungeon is a warm and welcoming place where people enjoy spending time, but as the night draws in, its tragic history seems to take over the ambience and can leave visitors terrified. There are lots of documented sightings of two particular ghosts at the dungeon, and both have been seen by independent witnesses spanning the decades. The nicest one seems to be an old parlor maid who can be seen carrying out her daily duties in the scullery as if still hard at work. When she has been seen, an air of homeliness and warmth is felt in an altogether motherly way. People have been shocked and scared by her, but she seems to mean no harm and does not interact with the living. As well as being seen in the scullery, she is often spotted going back and forth to the courtyard where there is an old well and also a herb garden. Witnesses have all described the same woman, wearing a cream dress with a white apron. She has grey hair piled up in a bun and is firm in stature. The other ghost often seen is not so nice in character. This is again a female spirit who has a nasty habit of chasing people down corridors. When Mark told me of this old hag, as he calls her, whilst stood in one of the many long empty hallways, my hair stood up on end and I could imagine just how terrifying this would be. The woman is said to be quite large but dirty looking, with long grey straggly hair around her face, wearing a stained worn old dress. Her teeth are rotten and she brings with her a smell of sulfur. One report was from a fire inspector who had been assessing the building for fire safety. It just so happened to be October when he visited, and around Halloween, the donjon holds many Halloween parties and events. The man was busy writing on his clipboard and looking at the fire doors when he heard a commotion further down the corridor. He looked up to see what was happening, and to his surprise he saw a woman shrieking and running down the corridor at him. It all happened in a flash, but as it was close to Halloween, he thought that the dungeon had employed staff to dress up and scare the visitors. Well, he was in for a shock when the woman hurtled towards him with no sign of slowing down. He raised his arms above his head to get ready for the inevitable impact when nothing but a blast of cold air hit him. He looked around him and the woman had vanished. There was nowhere she could have gone, but what made his skin really crawl was the insane laughter that echoed down the corridor. The fire inspector shifted himself into high gear and ran from the dungeon, even leaving behind him his vehicle, which had to be collected by a colleague the next day as he refused to return. This scary apparition seems to enjoy terrifying people, and there is at least one report every year of her chasing someone down the long lonely passages. The worst story about her is when a couple of kids in the late 60s broke into the dungeon for a dare. They found themselves wandering down one dark hallway, and unfortunately for them, she was waiting at the end for them. When their torches picked up this gnarled old hag running at full speed towards them, they panicked and began running in the opposite direction, only to find to their horror she was once again in front of them. The only way they could escape her was to jump out of one of the broken windows in the middle of the hallway. This they did, and with obvious results. 2 broken legs each and a long stay in hospital. A mental hospital. The other story that sticks in one's mind about the old hag is from a tourist who wrote to Mark after his experience whilst touring the dungeon. He wrote that after the tour, he had wanted to go back to one of the great halls and take some pictures of the beautiful carved oak paneling. On his way back to the hall, he mindlessly wandered down the passageway when from behind he heard shrieking and footfalls gaining pace on him. He turned around to see a beast of a woman charging at him, and in sheer terror he took off running himself. When he got to the hall, he sped in and slammed the door shut behind him, pushing himself against it whilst puffing and panting, looking for an escape route. The noise behind the door stopped, and he stood there for what seemed like a lifetime, not breathing, just listening. After an eternity, he thought it may be safe to at least breathe, but still stood stiff holding the wooden door shut. As he was beginning to think his ordeal was over and in his head was trying to process what he had seen, the old hag's arm and hand came shooting through the door next to him and started grabbing at his shirt. He could take no more and literally flew to the door on the other side of the hall, where he made his escape. He sprinted past the next tour group and heard one of them cry out with glee that they just couldn't wait to see whatever he had. Mark showed me the letter that he had received, and true to his word, this man's story was enough to give a grown man the shivers. How Mark lived, and in fact still lives in Winchester Dungeon is beyond me, especially with the stories he has told me. Nothing is known about the old hag ghost. Her history or why she might be haunting the dungeon is unknown. Maybe she is a member of a family long past who was deranged in her lifetime, who knows, but one thing is for sure, she is certainly deranged in this one. Join me next time for more haunting tales of dark shivering. Don't forget to click like and subscribe to hear more creepy content and never miss an episode.